Hey, it's Sam, and I'm making this video today about Mars-Venus conjunction. Brings together the passion of Mars and the desire of Venus. Mars separates and delineates, Venus accommodates. So check this out. When we have a Mars-Venus conjunction in the sky, we bring together the quality of Mars, which is about delineating our individuality and knowing what to fight for, what to stand for, where to draw the line. And Venus, which is about blurring those lines and reaching out to accommodate others. Rather than assert our individuality, Venus is where we want to harmonize that with another. And so anytime Mars and Venus come together, you bring these two opposite energies in play. And so it is very much a sort of inner conflict that develops when Mars and Venus join, when there's a conjunction or when there's an aspect as well, especially mutual aspect. So in particular though, the conjunction really brings a high level of passion and energy as well. Because Venus is also the planet that experiences pleasure and happiness. And literally Venus shows the things we enjoy, and that includes sex and sensuality and physicality. It's what makes the senses enjoyable, what makes the senses feel good. Chocolate tastes good. Ice cream tastes good. Art is beautiful. Men and women are beautiful to each other, and that beauty creates an attraction. We see a beautiful woman we want to touch and possess, or a handsome man we want to be engaged through the sense of touch and sight and smell and taste. And then that connects us eventually, when it's beyond the physical pleasure, to the emotional pleasure and the enjoyment, to ultimately finding pleasure and happiness and beauty in all things, where we don't need another person or another experience in order to feel the beauty. So Venus makes us engaged and makes us want to enjoy, and it as such pulls us out into the world. Mars, on the other hand, is where we ultimately want to be strong and where we're willing to suffer for our principles. Mars is very principled, where we don't need to enjoy things, we don't need to be happy. And in fact, the Mars part of you is the part of you that actually enjoys struggle and feels good when you overcome a challenge, when you surmount a challenge, particularly if it required a lot of effort and struggle. So it's the satisfaction that comes from sacrificing your happiness in the moment and that pleasure and comfort in the moment in order to do what you know is right, like work out or do something physical or take on some challenge, because the challenge is by nature difficult. It's hard. It's not easy. Venus wants things to be easy and pleasurable and happy. One of the first things that happens when we get into Mars territory is Venus energy stops. Meaning, in order to get the Venus pleasure, we have to cut out the Mars. In order to get the Mars power, we need to cut out the Venus. So for example, with the Venus pleasure and the Venus happiness, many times there's a quality of indulgence. Even if it's not indulgent, it's basically saying, my motivation is pleasure and enjoyment now, not strength and personal will or personal power. So, to be more specific, there's an example, let's say, of food. Venus wants to enjoy the food that tastes good, the food that tastes the best. I want to enjoy it because it's very pleasing. Mars wants to eat the food that makes me strongest, which is usually food that doesn't taste quite as good. I don't eat quite as much of it, because my only concern with Mars is what's going to make me strong. And I'm willing to sacrifice with Mars. And the thing I'm sacrificing is my pleasure, is my happiness, is the Venus thing. So the more powerful Mars is, the more Venus energy gets sacrificed. With Venus, the more Venus is pleasurable and powerful, the more Mars gets sacrificed. Like the Venus joy in relationship and joy in relating. It often requires that we put our own individual will and needs and power on hold. So in many ways, Venus' strength is the death of Mars. Mars' strength is the death of Venus, at least each moment. So this is why when those two things come together, there's a bit of a struggle and a bit of a conflict. And there's an excitement and there's a tension and a release. And you'll often see the energy and the willfulness of Mars to surmount a challenge gets brought into the Venus area, which is physicality, physical pleasure. So this is why there can be a lot of sexuality when Mars and Venus are joined, let's say in someone's natal chart. Especially when they're joined. When they're opposite, there can be quite a bit of struggle between those two things. When they're in the sky and they're joined like by transit, there's also that sort of passion where we simultaneously want to delineate and distinguish ourselves individually and enjoy the other person and enjoy other people. Venus is pretty much the stereotype of other people in general. And so it also helps us bring these two things together, but it brings them together through this sort of conflict and this sort of dynamic. One of the things to understand about astrological principles, it's often very common to say things like, well, doesn't that really balance? It sort of balances each other out. It balances, one balances the other out. Eventually there's a balance, quote, a balancing, but the balancing comes through struggle. It's like saying that eating too much food and then eating no food at all eventually balances itself out. Okay, I guess. Or sleeping too long and then not sleeping enough eventually balances out. Okay. Or asserting my individuality really strong and then compromising too much eventually balances out. So you want to understand, when planets join, they even if there's a balance, quote, achieved through a dynamic, it's a dynamic of extremes. It's one extreme and then the other, particularly when planets are opposite, like Mars and Venus. And they literally are opposite because you see where they rule opposite signs. Aries, Libra, Taurus, Scorpio. So when you see Mars, Venus joined, there can be a quality of arguing over boundaries and then compromising and coming together to sort of make up and harmonize our energy again. And then we harmonize, and then in the process of harmonizing and compromising, our individualities blow up again, and we may, get sort of pushed into our corners, and then because Venus is there, we don't want to be in the corners long, so we come back together, And then as we come back together and merge, we start to evaluate, am I compromising too much, and then kind of blow it up again and go back and forth. So notice people that had this in the natal chart, especially the conjunction. The opposition, it's more opposite, so there's more extremes with the opposition. The conjunction, it's more dynamic. And then you want to look at the signs, the sign element, particularly where it happens. If it's in feminine signs, generally Venus is going to get the better of it, and Mars will get the shorter end. In masculine signs, usually Venus gets the shorter end of it, you might say. But especially in fire signs, Venus gets the worst because Mars is fiery. In water signs, Mars would get the worst. Although Mars does rule Scorpio, and Venus doesn't do so well in Scorpio. And Mars is also better in Pisces. So I guess that elemental delineation is more anecdotal, because in Earth, Venus would get better, but again, Mars is exalted in Capricorn. That's probably the best place for the conjunction, because Mars is exalted and Venus is also strong in Capricorn. Air signs, Venus definitely gets the better of it, because Mars doesn't do so well in air signs. And Venus does quite well in air signs, because Venus is about that interchange, that interaction, especially through language and through words, and that tolerance and flexibility, and Mars wants things to be delineated and clear and right, wrong, good, bad. So again, in fire, Venus definitely gets the worst of it. In air, Mars definitely gets the worst of it. In Earth, generally, Mars gets the worst, except for in Capricorn, where because Mars is exalted and Venus is also strong, they both do okay. In water signs, again, in Cancer, Mars doesn't do so well because he's debilitated there. And in Pisces, Venus probably does a little worse. So you think about these things that way, but in general you'll understand that the element of the sign will support one more than the other. This is just a general principle. But for the most part, Mars, Venus, you see this opposition of compromise, accommodation through pleasure, desire, and happiness, which pulls us into engagement with another person, being measured against the clarity and distinction and delineation of Mars, wanting to be personally powerful.